My name is Serena Marsh. I'm 37 years old, and I read a property deed the way most people read a face, for what it's hiding. I spent 10 years in the Army learning to hold a position under pressure, and another 4 years saving every dollar I didn't spend overseas into a single account with a single purpose. What my in-laws did to that purpose cost me almost everything I'd built. What I did after cost them more. By the time I set my duffel down on the boards of that porch, I still hadn't seen what they'd done to the inside or learned where the money was really going. The house cost $425,000. I closed on it from a base in Grafenwohr, Germany, sitting in a folding chair with a laptop and a notary on a video call, signing my name to a deed that had exactly one name on it. Mine. Not Kyle's, not anyone else's. Mine. I want to be clear about that because it matters later. The deed was clean. One name, one signature, one owner. I'd learned early that paperwork doesn't lie the way people do, and I'd been careful in exactly the proportion that the situation required. The house is in Lincoln County, Oregon, Harlan Cove. It sits on a bluff above the Pacific, and it has a porch that catches the afternoon wind off the water, and a kitchen big enough for a family to actually move around in each other without apologizing. It has a hook by the front door, where my father hung brass wind chimes the day we handed him the keys. I want to tell you why that hook matters. But first, I need to tell you about my mother at a railing. I was 9 years old. My parents, Walt and Joan Marsh, had driven us up the Oregon coast for a weekend, which was not a small thing. Walt repaired tractors for a living. Joan polished other people's furniture. A weekend away meant a very specific kind of math, the kind where you subtract something necessary to afford something beautiful, and you don't mention the subtraction. We stopped at a scenic overlook somewhere north of Lincoln City. Joan got out of the car before it fully stopped. She walked to the railing at the edge of the bluff and put both hands on it and looked out at the water. The wind was coming up hard. Her hair went sideways. I watched her close her eyes. She stood there for a long time. Long enough that Walt and I exchanged a look over the hood of the car, his kind, patient, a little worried. Then she opened her eyes, and she said it. Not loud, not to us exactly, more like she was saying it to the water. "Wouldn't that be something," she said, "to fall asleep to that?" That was the whole sentence. She turned around, got back in the car, and we drove home. I never forgot it. I don't think I was supposed to. Walt and Joan were married 50 years as of the 14th of August. 50 years of tractor grease and furniture polish and a rented house in Medford with a yard that flooded every March. 50 years of making the math work and never once complaining about the subtraction. I started the Harlan Cove account 11 years ago. I named it that in my phone, just Harlan Cove, no other explanation, and I moved money into it every month the way you'd tend something growing. Slowly, without making a fuss about it. I deployed twice in that time. I missed Thanksgiving 4 times, Christmas twice, and my own 30th birthday. I was not looking for sympathy about any of that. It was a choice I made with full information, and I'd make it again. But I want you to understand the weight of the account when I finally closed on the property. It wasn't a gift I bought. It was a decade I converted. I told Kyle about the plan in the 2nd year of our marriage. He was supportive. That's the honest word for it. Supportive. The way a wall is supportive. Present, structural, not particularly warm about it. He met Walt and Joan twice before we married, and 3 times after. He was polite. His mother Brenda was 62 years old and had opinions about most things, including my parents, which she delivered at a volume she considered conversational. His brother Dustin worked construction when he felt like it and borrowed money when he didn't. I am not telling you this to build a case against them. I'm telling you because the people in a story matter, and so does the order in which you understand them. I closed on the house in February. I flew home in August, 14 days before Walt and Joan's anniversary, to get the place ready. I bought a porch swing. I hung a hook by the front door. I stock the kitchen with the things my mother actually uses: real coffee, not pods, and a cast iron pan and a bottle of the lemon oil she uses on furniture, because she uses it on everything, including, I suspect, her own hands. I wrapped the keys in a card that said 50 years and left it at that. The plan was simple. The anniversary party was on the 14th. Both sides of the family were coming. I would hand my parents the keys in front of everyone, and then I would drive back to the airport 2 days later and return to Germany, knowing that Joan had a railing to stand at for the rest of her life. Simple, clean, already paid for. I flew back to Germany. I waited, and then the utility bills started climbing. Utility bills don't lie. People do, but a bill just reports what happened, how much water ran, how much heat was pulled, how many kilowatt hours a house consumed in a month. And the bills for Harlan Cove were climbing in a way that a house with 2 retired people in it simply doesn't climb. I was in Germany when I noticed. I had set up automatic access to the accounts, the utilities, the property tax, the homeowner's insurance, because that's how I run things. I don't wait to be told. I check. October's electric bill was 40% higher than September's. I noted it. November came in higher still. I told myself it was the heating system adjusting to the season. The house was on the coast. The wind off the water is a different animal than inland cold. And Walt and Joan had spent 50 years in Medford, where you don't think much about sea drafts. Maybe they were running the heat higher than they needed to. Maybe they'd left a window open somewhere. I told myself that for about 3 weeks. Then Joan called me on a Sunday, which she does every Sunday, regular as a utility bill herself. And in the middle of telling me about a walk she and Walt had taken on the bluff, she said Kyle's family had been out at the coast a lot lately. She said it the way you'd mention the weather, casual, informational. And then she moved on to something else. I filed it. The second mention came 2 Sundays later. Joan doesn't gossip. That's not false modesty about my mother, it's just accurate. She is a woman who spent decades in other people's houses polishing their furniture, and she learned early that you keep what you see to yourself. She doesn't repeat things. She doesn't circle back. But she mentioned Kyle's family again. Same tone, same casual delivery. And that second mention was the tell. Joan never says a thing twice unless she's trying to say it without saying it. I wrote it down. I was sitting at my desk in Grafenvohr with a notepad I kept for exactly this kind of thing. Small observations that didn't fit anywhere else, details that hadn't earned a category yet. I wrote, Kyle's family, coast, twice. And then I drew a line under it and waited. A photo arrived in our family group chat around that time. Joan had taken it. She'd gotten better with her phone that year, and she liked sending pictures of the house, the view, the way the light came off the water in the late afternoon. This one was of the living room, but it was cropped tight, angled in a way that showed the couch, the window, the light, and cut off the left side of the room completely. Joan is not a photographer. She doesn't compose shots. She points and presses. So the crop wasn't artistry. Something was on the left side of that room that she either didn't want me to see or had been asked to keep out of the frame. I looked at that photo for a long time. I couldn't tell which it was, and I didn't want to assume the wrong thing about my mother. I wrote that down too. Photo, cropped left, living room. Here's what I did not do. I did not call Kyle. I did not call Brenda. I did not send a long message into the family chat asking what was going on. I had learned in 10 years of military service that the worst thing you can do when you suspect a problem is announce that you suspect it. You lose every advantage you have the moment you show your hand. So I watched. I kept the notepad. I checked the bills every month and wrote down the numbers. December's water bill came in at nearly double what it had been in September. Not a little high, double. That's not 2 people forgetting to turn off a tap. That's a house running at a different volume than it should be. More showers, more laundry, more dishes, more people moving through rooms and leaving the ordinary evidence of their presence in the pipes. I wrote, water, December, volume of a full house. I tried calling Joan on a Tuesday, not our usual Sunday, which I knew would put her on alert that something was wrong. I kept it light. Asked how the kitchen was holding up, whether the cast iron pan was getting used, whether Walt had found a good spot for his chair. She was warm. She was fine. She mentioned that Dustin had been helping with some things around the house, which was good of him, wasn't it? Dustin, Kyle's brother, the one who worked construction when he felt like it. I said yes, that was good of him. I asked what kind of things. She said, "Oh, just odds and ends. You know Dustin." I didn't push. I said I'd talk to her Sunday. I hung up and I wrote, "Dustin, in the house, odds and ends." By January, I had 4 pages of notes and no proof of anything. I had a pattern, the bills, the mentions, the cropped photo, Dustin's name appearing where it had no reason to appear, but a pattern isn't evidence. A pattern is just a shape you've noticed. You need the thing inside the shape before you can do anything with it. I was leaving Germany in July. The anniversary was in August. That gave me 7 months to watch, and then 2 weeks on the ground to understand what I was looking at. I didn't tell Kyle I was coming early. I didn't tell anyone. I booked the flight in January, from a different account than the one he had access to, and I said nothing. Some people call that calculating. I call it the difference between arriving prepared and arriving surprised, and I had already decided which one I was going to be. Landing at Portland felt different than it usually does. I've come home from overseas enough times that I know what my body does when the wheels touch down. There's a release somewhere in the shoulders, a small mechanical unclenching. This time, it didn't come. I rented a car at the airport and drove the Coast Highway south. It was a Tuesday in late July, 2 weeks before the anniversary, 3 weeks before I was supposed to arrive according to anything I'd told anyone. The Pacific was gray and flat to my right. I had 4 pages of notes in my bag and a deed in my phone's cloud storage, photographed front and back. I wasn't nervous. I was paying attention. Those are different things. I turned onto the gravel drive at Harlan Cove just after 2 in the afternoon. The first thing I saw was the cars. 3 of them. None of them Walt's truck. None of them familiar. A silver SUV, a white sedan with out-of-state plates, and a blue hatchback parked up on the grass at the edge of the bluff, like someone who didn't know or didn't care what salt air does to a car's undercarriage. I stopped at the base of the drive and sat with the engine running. Not panic. Not yet. Just the careful, deliberate act of looking before you move. The second thing I saw was the sign. It was staked into Joan's flower bed, the one shed planted in May with the lavender and the small white things shed redded in gardening magazine, the ones that do well near salt water. The sign was corrugated plastic, the kind you see outside real estate offices, and it read, "Guest parking. Please keep drive clear." Guest parking. In my mother's flower bed. I turned the engine off. I sat another full minute. Then I got out of the car, lifted my duffel from the back seat, and walked up the drive. The hook by the front door was bare. Walt had hung the brass wind chimes there on the day we gave them the keys. He'd climbed up on the porch railing with his shaking hands, and Joan had stood below him saying, "Walt, please, get down from there." And he'd laughed and said he was fine, and hung them anyway. It watched from the steps. The chimes had rung in the wind off the water, and Joan had covered her mouth with one hand. The hook was empty now. The chimes were gone. I noted it. I kept walking. Joan was on the porch in her good blue cardigan, the one she saves for occasions, the one with the small pearl buttons she's had since before I was born. She had her hand pressed flat over her mouth, the same way she'd pressed it the day Walt hung the chimes, except this time, nothing was ringing. Her eyes were red. Walt was on the porch steps. He had 2 suitcases beside him, both of them packed, both of them the old plaid ones from the hall closet. His hands were shaking worse than the Parkinson's usually makes them shake. That's a specific kind of shaking, the kind that comes from something other than the illness. I looked at my father's hands. I looked at my mother's face. I looked at the bare hook. Brenda came out of the front door behind them. She was 62 years old, wearing a linen shirt I'd never seen before, and she had the particular expression of someone who has rehearsed what they're about to say and is confident in the rehearsal. She looked at me the way you look at someone you've already decided is in the wrong place. "This is our house," she said. "Get out." Not quiet, not a private conversation, loud enough that the people in those 3 strange cars, whoever they were, wherever they'd come from, could hear it through the windows if they were listening. I set my duffel down on the boards, slow, one handle at a time. I didn't respond. Not yet. I let the silence do the first part of the work, because the silence was already doing it better than anything I could have said. What I wanted to do and what I did are 2 different things, and I want to be precise about that. Every cell in my body wanted to put Brenda back through that front door and change the locks behind her. Instead, I stood on my own porch, in front of my own parents, and I breathed through it. I looked at Joan. She was watching me the way she used to watch me before a school exam, steady, a little frightened, trusting me to know what to do. I didn't tell her it was going to be fine. I don't make promises I can't keep in the first 60 seconds of a situation. I picked my duffel back up. I said, "Mom, Dad, come with me." Walt reached for his suitcases. Brenda took a step forward, not toward him, toward me, and I turned and looked at her. Just looked. I didn't say a word. I held it for 3 full seconds, which is longer than most people are comfortable with, and then I picked up both of Walt's suitcases myself, one in each hand, and walked them to my rental car. Joan followed. Walt followed. Neither of them looked back. I hadn't been inside the house yet. I didn't know what was in there. I still didn't know where the money was going or whose name was on the rental listing or how long it had been running. What I knew was this. My parents had suitcases on the porch of a house I'd spent a decade buying for them. That was enough to work with for now. After Walt and Joan were in the car, I went back inside. I want to be clear about why. It wasn't to confront anyone. It wasn't to make a scene in front of whoever was staying in my house. It was because I needed to see it, the actual, physical evidence of what had been done, before I could build anything useful around it. You don't file a report on what you suspect. You file it on what you've seen. So I went in. The smell hit me in the doorway. Chemical lemon over bleach, the particular combination that short-term rentals develop when strangers cycle through fast enough that the cleaning crew has to work quickly and the next guests arrive before the air has settled. It's the smell of a place that's been made to seem clean rather than actually lived in. I knew it from hotels near bases, from transit housing, from every temporary room I'd slept in for a decade. It was not the smell of my mother's lemon oil, not even close. The bedroom doors had brass numerals screwed into them, small ones, the kind you'd find at a hardware store, mounted at eye level on each door in the hallway. Room 1, Room 2, Room 3. My parents' bedroom, the one with the window that faces the water, the one Joan had stood in for 10 minutes on the day we handed them the keys, just looking, had a small brass 2 on its door. I stood in the hallway and looked at those numbers for a moment. Not angry, not yet, just cataloging. The kitchen was worse. There was a folding table against the far wall with a wicker basket on it, the kind you see in hotel lobbies, single-serve coffee pods, individually wrapped tea bags, a small laminated card propped against the basket that said, "Welcome to Harlan Cove Beachfront Retreat." There was a guest book, spiral-bound, sitting open on the counter beside the cast-iron pan I'd bought for Joan. The pan hadn't moved. It was pushed to the back of the counter like something in the way. A folding check-in sign sat on the kitchen table, laminated, professionally printed. Checkout by 11, Wi-Fi password in bold. This was not a guest room in a family home. This was a managed property. That's when Dustin appeared. He came through the hallway from the back of the house carrying a stack of folded towels balanced on his forearm, the way a hotel bellhop carries them, practiced, efficient, like he'd done it enough times that it had become a posture. He was Kyle's brother, 34 years old, and he had the look of a man who had not expected to see me and was deciding very quickly how to arrange his face. He settled on casual. "Hey, Serena, didn't know you were coming." I said, "I can see that." Kyle came in from the back porch a moment later. He looked at Dustin first, then at me, then at the room, as if he was calculating which version of the conversation he was in. He opened with something about how the rental had been helping with cash flow, how things had been tight, how he'd meant to talk to me about it. I let him talk. I've learned that if you stay quiet long enough, people will tell you exactly what you need to know without you having to ask for it. Then I said, flat and even, "You're running it like a hotel." The look that passed between Kyle and Dustin in that half second answered every question I'd written in my notepad over the past 6 months. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was the particular expression of two people who have been caught not in a mistake, but in a plan. Something they'd discussed, arranged, and decided on together, and had simply hoped would stay undiscovered long enough to become normal. I didn't say anything else. Not in that room, not to either of them. I'm not going to pretend I was calm in that minute. I wasn't. But I've learned what to do with a feeling that size. You don't waste it. You don't spend it on the people who caused it. Not right there. Not when the situation is still live and the ground is still shifting. You point it somewhere useful, and you move. I walked back through the kitchen. I looked at the guest book, opened to a page with 4 entries in 4 different handwriting styles, dates going back to March. March. They'd been running this since March. 5 months. My parents had been living in a managed short-term rental for 5 months without telling me, and the only signal I'd caught was a climbing utility bill and the fact that my mother had mentioned Dustin's name once when she shouldn't have had a reason to. I picked up the laminated welcome card from the counter. I read it front to back. Wi-Fi password, checkout time, house rules, and near the bottom, in smaller print, a line that I read twice to make sure I had it right. Owner's storage. Please do not disturb. There was a door marked with that sign. The door to the small back room, the one Walt had set up as a reading room, with his chair and his lamp and the box of fishing magazines had been collecting since 1980-something. My parents were the owner's storage. They'd been filed away behind a door so paying strangers wouldn't be inconvenienced by the people who actually lived there. I set the card back on the counter exactly where I'd found it. Then I went back to the car, where Walt and Joan were waiting, and I drove us away from the house without saying a word about what I'd seen. There would be time for words. I needed a lawyer first. The motel was 15 minutes up the highway, licensed, oceanfront, clean in the way that places run by people who care are clean, which is different from the chemical lemon clean of a managed property cycling strangers through on a schedule. I got Walt and Joan a room on the 2nd floor facing the water. Joan stood at the window for a moment when we walked in, looking out at the Pacific, and I thought about the railing and said nothing. Walt sat on the edge of the bed. His hands had slowed down by then, the bad shaking had passed, leaving just the ordinary tremor. He looked at me the way he used to look at me when I was a kid and had handled something on my own that he thought he should have handled for me. A little proud, a little ashamed he hadn't gotten there first. I told them both to get some rest. I said I'd be back in the morning. Joan caught my arm at the door. She said, "Serena, how bad is it?" I looked at her. Pearl buttons, red eyes, the good blue cardigan shed worn because she hadn't known what else to wear when strangers were in her kitchen. I said, "I've seen worse situations come out cleaner. Get some sleep, Mom." That was true. And it was enough. The motel had a vending alcove off the parking lot with a buzzing fluorescent light and a plastic chair someone had left outside the ice machine. I sat in that chair with my legal pad on my knee and I wrote for 2 hours. Not feelings, a movement order. Who was physically present in the house? Brenda, Kyle, Dustin, and at minimum 3 sets of guests based on the cars in the drive. Who had put the listing up? Dustin's name was the one I'd need to confirm, but the operational fingerprints were his. The towels, the check-in sign, the ease of a man moving through a space he'd decided was his to manage. Who was holding the revenue? Unknown, but the debt would point there. How long it had been running? The guest book showed March, which meant 5 months of bookings at whatever rate they'd set. I wrote it all down in the order I'd need to address it. The rate was something I didn't know yet that night. I found it the next morning, sitting in the same plastic chair with a cup of gas station coffee, when I pulled up the rental platform on my phone and searched Harlan Cove. It came up on the second scroll. 4 photos: the porch, the living room, the kitchen, the water view, and a nightly rate of $340. $340 a night. My parents' home. Listed under a host profile with Dustin's name and a response rate of 98%, which told me he'd been doing this long enough to build a rating. He wasn't a man who'd done something desperate once. He was a man who had built a small business on a foundation he didn't own. I photographed the listing on my phone. I wrote down the URL, the host ID, the nightly rate, and the number of reviews. 22 of them, going back to late March. By 7:30 that morning, I was on the highway, driving south to Newport. Paula Renner's office was above a bait shop on the harbor side of town, up a narrow staircase that smelled like salt and old wood, into a room with 2 windows and a desk stacked with folders organized in a system that only made sense to her, which is the sign of a lawyer who actually works, rather than one who performs working. She had a gray bob and reading glasses on a chain, and the particular stillness of someone who has heard a great many urgent stories and learned to let them finish before she speaks. I laid the deed on her desk before I sat down. She picked it up. She read it. She set it back down. "One name," she said. "One name," I said. Paula led with the wall, because that's what good lawyers do. They show you the obstacle before they show you the path, so you don't waste energy being surprised by it later. "Oregon's forcible entry and detainer process," she said. "The FED. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't simple, but it was the correct instrument. The word she used most in that first 10 minutes was patient. The second word she used most was exact. I told her I was familiar with both concepts. She almost smiled. "Military?" "Army," I said. 14 years. She nodded once and pulled out a yellow legal pad of her own, which I took as a good sign. The second front was the rental itself. Unpermitted short-term rental in Lincoln County, there were specific lodging tax requirements, registration requirements, and Dustin had met none of them. Paula made a note. The platform report was the third front, a property listed by someone who was not the owner with the deed as documentation. She made another note. 3 fronts, 3 separate processes, 3 different timelines that I was going to have to run in parallel with the patience of someone who has learned that the right outcome at the wrong speed is still a loss. "You have the deed," Paula said. "That's the whole thing, really. Everything else is just process. I've always fought better by the book." The book, in this case, was Oregon Property Law, Lincoln County Code, and a platform's Terms of Service, and I had read all 3 before I sat down in that chair. Paula walked me out to the landing above the bait shop. The harbor smell came up through the boards. "Come back Thursday," she said. "Bring everything you have." I had everything I needed. Thursday felt like a long time away, but I'd waited 6 months already. I could wait 2 more days. Thursday came and went. So did Friday. Paula moved with the deliberate speed of someone who understood that a filing done correctly once is worth more than 3 done quickly and wrong. I didn't rush her. I sat in the motel parking lot in the evenings with my legal pad, and I waited, which is a skill the Army teaches you whether you want it or not. Not patience exactly, but the disciplined management of the gap between knowing what needs to happen and being able to make it happen yet. What I did in those 2 days was go back to the house, not to confront anyone, to document. I went in the morning, both days, when the guests, whoever was in the silver SUV, whoever had parked the blue hatchback on the grass at the edge of the bluff, were either still asleep or out walking. The coast in July draws a particular kind of visitor, people who wake up late, make coffee from a pod, and spend the morning on the porch with their feet up, watching the water like they own the view. They don't look at the deed. They don't need to. That's someone else's problem, and they've paid their $340 a night not to think about it. Brenda's car was gone both mornings. Kyle's truck was in the drive the first day, but Kyle didn't come to the door when I knocked. I stood on the porch for a full 30 seconds, long enough that he'd have had to decide deliberately not to answer, and then I tried the handle, which was unlocked, and went in. That was fine. I didn't need him for this part. I photographed the brass numerals on the bedroom doors. Small ones, the kind sold in sets of 10 at any hardware store, mounted at eye level with 2 screws each. Someone had done it carefully, level, the way you do something you expect to last. I photographed the folding table in the kitchen with the wicker basket and the single-serve pods arranged in a small fan, the way hotels arrange them to look like abundance. I photographed the check-in sign, the guest book open to its current page, the laminated house rules taped inside the bathroom door. No smoking, no pets, quiet hours after 10, check out by 11. I photographed the back room with the owner's storage sign. Walt's chair was visible through the gap where the door hadn't fully latched. His reading chair, the brown one with the worn armrest that he'd had since before I was born, pushed into a corner to make room for 2 rolled-up yoga mats and a folded pack-and-play that belonged to someone's guests. His lamp was still there. His box of fishing magazines from the 80s was still there, stacked under the chair like it had been put away rather than put out. 41 photographs, time-stamped, backed up to 2 separate cloud accounts before I got back in the car. The laminated welcome card was still on the kitchen counter where I'd left it. I picked it up again. I don't know exactly why, except that some details ask to be looked at twice. I read it front to back, the way you read a document you're about to sign, slowly, looking for the thing you missed the first time. I found it near the bottom, in a font size slightly smaller than the rest. Owner's storage. Please do not disturb. I'd seen it before. I'd understood it before. But standing there in that kitchen, in the smell of chemical lemon and other people's mornings, holding that card in both hands, I understood it differently. My mother had been told to stay out of her own kitchen, so paying strangers wouldn't be confused. My mother, who had spent 30 years polishing other people's furniture, who had finally been given a kitchen of her own, with a cast-iron pan and a view of the water and a porch swing she hadn't sat in yet because there was always a guest who might want it. She had been managed out of her own space with the quiet efficiency of a property management policy. My father had been filed away behind a door with a sign on it. His chair, his magazines, his lamp, they had been categorized, managed, made into a footnote in the property they were supposed to inherit. If a relative has ever moved into something you built and treated you like the guest, you know this exact cold feeling. You know it in your chest before you can name it. I photographed the card front and back in the good light from the kitchen window. Then I put it in my jacket pocket next to my unit's challenge coin, 2 flat pieces of cold metal, one earned and one stolen, and I knew which was which. I knew which one I was keeping. Paula called that afternoon, just after 2. The Fed paperwork was ready to file. The county complaint was drafted. Lincoln County had a specific process for unpermitted short-term rentals, and Dustin had met none of the registration requirements, paid none of the lodging tax, and filed none of the disclosures the county required. Shed confirmed with the platform's trust and safety team what documentation they'd need for an ownership dispute: the deed, the listing URL, a written statement, and a copy of the county property record showing my name as sole owner. She walked me through the timeline in the flat, informational tone of someone delivering a weather forecast. This will happen, then this, then this. No promises about speed. No false comfort about how the other side would respond, just the sequence, the dependencies, and the realistic range of outcomes if everything moved as expected, and if something didn't. I asked her one question: could all 3 processes be timed to converge on the 14th of August? She was quiet for a moment. That's 3 weeks. I know, it's tight. I know that too. Another pause, then, "It's possible," she said, "if nothing stalls." I told her to file everything the next morning. She said she'd have confirmation to me by noon. The anniversary party had been planned for months, both sides of the family, folding chairs in the yard, a cooler, kids running the bluff. Joan had talked about it since January. She'd made a list of who was bringing what dish, who needed directions, whether there'd be enough chairs for the older relatives who couldn't stand long. She'd planned it with the particular care of a woman who doesn't take celebrations for granted, who knows that a 50th anniversary is not a thing that happens twice. It had been on the calendar since January, which meant Kyle knew about it, Brenda knew about it, and Dustin knew about it. They had planned to run paying guests through that house, right up to and including the weekend of Walt and Joan's 50th anniversary. And simply, what? Hoped I wouldn't notice? Hoped I'd arrive from Germany and find some version of normal they'd assembled in the preceding 48 hours? I don't know what they thought. I stopped trying to reconstruct other people's logic around the point where the logic stops making sense. What I knew was this: the 14th was the right date. Not for drama, not to make a scene in front of an audience, but because every person who needed to understand what had happened would be standing in that yard. Both sides of the family, the people who loved Walt and Joan, and the people who had decided that love was a resource to be leveraged. And the truth is easier to deliver when it only has to be said once. I underlined the date on my legal pad. Then I drew a box around it. That evening, I went back to the motel. Walt was awake, sitting in the chair by the window with the curtains open, watching the water go dark. He had his hands folded in his lap, still, the way they get when he's been sitting quietly for a while and the tremor has settled into something manageable. Joan was in the bathroom. I could hear the water running. I sat on the edge of the bed and I told him, plainly, without softening it, what I'd found in the house, what Paula had filed that morning, and what the next 3 weeks were going to look like. I told him about the Fed. I told him about the county complaint. I told him about the platform report and what it would do to Dustin's booking calendar when it went through. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always loved about my father. He lets a thing be fully said before he responds. He learned it from years of listening to engines. You don't diagnose a tractor by talking over it. You listen until it tells you what's wrong. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You knew something was wrong before you came home, didn't you?" "Yes," I said. He nodded slowly. "Your mother thought so too. She didn't want to worry you." I sat with that for a second. Joan, who had mentioned Kyle's family twice in 2 separate phone calls and then stopped, who had sent a cropped photo of the living room and never explained why, who had stayed quiet for 5 months in a house full of strangers because she didn't want to put that weight on me from 8,000 miles away. That was the moment I understood the full shape of it, not just what Kyle and Dustin had done, but what it had cost Walt and Joan to carry it. To stay in that house, in the room with the brass 2 on the door, while paying guests used their kitchen and left their towels on their porch railing, and checked out by 11 and left reviews praising the beautiful ocean views. 5 months. They had held it alone for 5 months. The water in the bathroom stopped running. Joan came out, saw my face, and sat down beside me on the bed without asking a question. She just put her hand over mine for a moment. That was enough. I wrote one more thing in my legal pad that night, under everything else. The date holds, the 14th. And then, Kyle showed up in the parking lot. Serena. That's how he started. Just my name, from the edge of the parking lot, in the tone of a man who has rehearsed an opening line and decided that simple is safer. Kyle was standing under the buzzing fluorescent light outside the motel's vending alcove, the same light I'd been sitting under for 3 evenings with my legal pad. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and the particular posture of someone who wants to appear relaxed and isn't. I'd seen that posture before, in other contexts, on other people. It's the posture of someone who needs something from you and hasn't decided yet how to ask for it. The posture of a man who has run the conversation in his head enough times that he's stopped accounting for how the other person might actually respond. I closed my legal pad. I waited. He came and sat in the plastic chair across from mine. Someone had added a second one at some point, which I hadn't arranged and didn't ask about. He looked at the ground for a moment, the way people do when they're locating the version of themselves they'd planned to be. Then he looked at me. And then he told the truth. I'll give him that. He didn't open with an excuse or a deflection or a version of events designed to make his choices look like circumstances. He told me what had actually happened, in the order it had actually happened, and I sat and listened to all of it without moving. The contracting business had collapsed 18 months ago. Not slowly, fast, the way a structure fails when the load-bearing element gives. One large contract pulled, then the line of credit called, then the suppliers, then the payroll. He'd been running a crew of 7 people. 6 of them had families. He'd kept paying them out of personal savings for 3 months after the contract fell through, trying to bridge to the next job, and the next job hadn't come. Nearly $60,000 in debt, accumulated over 14 months, and he hadn't told me. Not a word, not a hint, not a single Sunday phone call where he'd said, "Serena, I need to tell you something." 18 months. I'd been in Germany, watching utility bills and writing things in a notepad, and he'd been drowning in $60,000 of debt he'd decided to keep to himself. I want to be honest about what I felt in that part of the conversation, because it matters to the shape of what came next. I felt something real. Not surprise. I'd had weeks to build a working theory, and the theory had been close to this. But something adjacent to grief. The particular grief of understanding exactly how a person got somewhere terrible, and knowing that understanding doesn't change where they are. I gave him a full minute of genuine feeling about that. There was a minute, maybe a little more, where I looked at my husband under that buzzing light and held the weight of it. He wasn't a villain in that minute. He was a man who'd made a series of choices that each seemed survivable in isolation and catastrophic in some, and who had run out of options and grabbed the nearest rope. The rope happened to be my parents' house. I understood the mechanism. I didn't excuse it. Those are different things, and I kept them separate, the way you keep a diagnosis separate from a treatment plan. You need to understand the first before you can build the second, but understanding it doesn't mean accepting it. He said Dustin had come up with the rental idea. That part I already knew. The listing was in Dustin's name. The operational fingerprints were Dustin's. The towels stacked on his forearm and the check-in sign and the 98% response rate were all Dustin's work. Kyle said he told himself it was temporary, a bridge, a few months of bookings to cover the most urgent debt while he figured out the next contract. He said he'd meant to tell Walt and Joan it was temporary. He said he'd meant to sit down with my father, who had shaken hands with Kyle at our wedding, and said, "She's the best of us, you take care of her," and explain the situation and ask for a few months' grace. He said he'd meant to tell me. He'd meant to do a lot of things. I didn't say any of that out loud. I let him finish, because a person who is confessing will tell you more if you don't interrupt them than if you do. It's the same principle as the utility bills. You wait, and the numbers tell you what's actually happening. And then he said the line that ended it. "It's marital property anyway, Serena." He said it carefully, like a man placing a card he's been holding back, not aggressively, not as a threat, but in the measured tone of someone who believes they're introducing a reasonable point into a reasonable conversation. Half of it is basically mine. Not angry, not loud, just confident in a way that told me he'd looked this up, or thought he had, and arrived at a conclusion that felt solid to him. I looked at him for a moment. The fluorescent light buzzed. A car passed on the highway, its headlights sweeping across the lot and gone. "Paula explained Oregon's marital property law to me on Thursday," I said. "Property acquired before the marriage, purchased solely with premarital funds, held in one name, with no marital contributions to mortgage or maintenance, that's separate property. The deed has one name on it. That name is mine." He started to say something. I kept going, even and level, the way you deliver a briefing when the information is not open for discussion. The filing went in this morning. FED in Lincoln County Circuit Court. The county complaint for the unpermitted rental went in at the same time. The platform report went in yesterday, with the deed attached and the listing URL and a written statement of ownership. The careful expression had been wearing came apart in pieces. Not dramatically, more like a document losing its formatting, everything still there, just no longer holding its shape. The rehearsed calm, the reasonable man posture, the card had been holding, all of it went soft under the specific weight of 3 filed documents with dates and docket numbers. He tried once more, said Paula could be wrong, said property law was complicated, that maybe they should get a second opinion before anything went further, that surely there was a way to slow this down and talk it through like 2 people who were still, technically, married. I let that sit in the air between us for a moment. Then I said, "The deed doesn't change because we talk about it." That was the end of that. He wanted my pity to buy his silence. I want to be precise about that, because it matters to everything that followed. The confession wasn't an act of honesty, it was a negotiation. He'd come to that parking lot under that buzzing light to give me the truth in exchange for something, and the something was the 3 filings he'd already made. He'd calculated correctly that the truth would cost him less than the alternative, and incorrectly that he'd gotten there before I had. He got my pity. He did not get my silence. I told him I was sorry about the business. I meant it. The business, the crew of 7, the 3 months of personal savings he'd burned trying to keep people employed. That part was real, and I said so. I told him I understood that $60,000 of debt is a particular kind of terror, the kind that narrows your vision until the nearest available solution starts to look like a reasonable one, even when it isn't. I meant that too. And then I told him that understanding something and accepting its consequences are not the same thing, and that he'd already done the only thing I knew how to do, which was file the correct paperwork with the correct offices and let the process run its course at its own speed, which was going to be faster than he'd like and slower than he'd prefer. He sat there for a moment after I finished. The posture he'd arrived with, the careful, rehearsed calm of a man who'd walked across a parking lot with a plan, was gone. What was left was just Kyle, in a plastic chair, under a buzzing light, in a motel parking lot off the Oregon coast, with fewer options than he'd had an hour ago and a clearer picture of how few they were. He said, "So that's it." I said, "That's the part I control. The rest is up to the process." He stood up. He didn't say anything else. He walked back across the parking lot to his truck, a walk of maybe 30 feet that looked longer than it was, and he sat in it for a few minutes without starting the engine. I watched the cab light stay on. Then it went off. Then the engine turned over, and he pulled out of the lot and onto the highway heading south. I sat for a moment in the quiet after his taillights disappeared. The vending machine hummed. The fluorescent light buzzed its single note. Somewhere down the hall of the motel, a door opened and closed. Walt, probably, checking whether I was still out there. I was. Then I opened my legal pad. I wrote the time, 9:47, and the date, and 3 words. Confession. Filed. Noted. I drew a line under it. Clean, single stroke, 3 weeks to the 14th of August. 3 processes running in 3 separate offices, each on its own timeline, each aimed at the same yard on the same afternoon. And somewhere in a house that had my name on its deed, a calendar full of strangers' bookings that was about to have a very bad Friday. The kind of Friday that starts with a platform notification and ends with a cascade of cancellation emails, each one a refunded guest, each one a few $100s evaporating from a revenue stream that had been built on a foundation nobody owned. Dustin had built something efficient. I'd give him that. He just hadn't checked whose name was on the deed.